Today we're reviewing the movie The Equalizer 1 and 2, starring Denzel Washington. The movie begins as Robert McCall, played by Washington, is trying to live a normal life. As McCall adapts to his new lifestyle working at the local hardware store, he befriends Ralphie, one of his co-workers. The two develop a lasting friendship. Due to insomnia, Robert has trouble sleeping most nights, so he has to spend time at a local diner. And that's where he encounters a young lady who frequents the diner as well. On most evenings, Robert spends his evening reading the book The Old Man and the Sea. The two eventually become friends just by acquaintance. The next day, while at work, a couple of Robert's co-workers come by, inquiring about his previous profession. Robert likens himself to Gladys Knight and the Pips and says that he was one of the dancers, which they don't buy it. The next day finds Robert back at the diner, in which he sees the young lady again. The young lady inquires about the book that he's been reading and asks about its finality. Robert obliges and explains to her. At that moment, they are interrupted by the arrival of a limousine. The young lady receives a call from Slavy, and despite her reluctance, she goes outside. The following day finds Robert and the young lady meeting at the diner again. This is where she explains that her name is Elena and that she's an aspiring singer. She even offers Robert a CD just to show her work. Robert carefully scans over her CD and assures Elena that she can be whatever she likes as long as she puts her mind to it. As the night progresses, Slavy returns and hits Elena, stating she disrespected a customer. Robert McCall does nothing at this point, and Slavik hands him a card. As time ticks by, Elena is noticeably missing from the diner. The manager eventually spills the beans that she's been in the ICU. Deeply concerned, McCall goes over to the hospital where he spots her friend Mandy. At first, Mandy is reluctant, but then when McCall shows that he's a friend, she reveals that she's stuck in the same line of work as Elena. She goes on to tell Robert that Elena was beaten because she disrespected Slavy in front of one of his customers. Later that evening, Robert reveals the card that was given to him and contemplates whether he should intervene. He remembers making a promise to his late wife that he would not revert back to his violent past. However, after contemplating, he decides action must be taken. As the night progresses, Robert follows Slavik to his restaurant, which has a meeting spot for him and his henchmen above the restaurant. As he enters, he presents Slavik with $9,800 for the purchase of Elena. Slavik laughs, then accepts it, but then ridicules him, telling him to do something very disgusting with his $9,800. He tells him to go home and that money would only buy 1 month of freedom for Elena. As Robert gathers his things and attempts to head towards the door, he moves pieces on the table as if it were a chess game. As he reaches the door, he contemplates thinking of what he told his wife, but then he realizes of all the girls that are being abused by these monsters and goes back. As Robert annihilates his henchmen, Slavik is shot in the throat. As Robert continues to destroy his men, eliminating them one by one, he reaches one of them who was making fun of him earlier. Thinking that Robert didn't understand him, he fully well did, and uses a corkscrew to annihilate him. As Robert checks his watch at 28 seconds, he had originally given himself 16 seconds to finish. He goes over to Slavik and tells him, "You should have taken the $9,800. Your life is going to end on this dirty floor," while Elena's continues. Later, he washes up, puts his ring on, and apologizes to his deceased wife. Later that night, a Russian mobster named Teddy appears. Teddy, who's tasked with finding out who murdered the Russian mobsters, assembles a group of corrupt cops in which he orders them to use a 6-block radius of video footage to try and find the man responsible. Teddy explains to the cops that he was sent there to do the job that they couldn't finish. Continuing his investigation, he's taken to Frank Masters, who's a local mobster who plays dumb on the murders. He also states his distaste with Russians. He dismisses one of his men, while he shows him his appreciation for his distaste. As one of the men secures a weapon, anticipating that there's going to be trouble. As the situation rises, Slavic punches him and begins to pummel him and beat him while the disgraced cop kills the other men. Later that night, Slavic, while still researching the issue, realizes that this is not a normal mafia hit. He actually starts to admire the work of the assassin, but he has to find out who he is. While still scanning the footage, Slavic notices Robert leaving the building. Later, Robert wonders why Ralphie hasn't clocked in. He asks the scheduling manager, who stated that he quit unexpectedly. The next day, Robert goes over to Ralphie's mom's store to see if he can find him, in which he does. Ralphie tells him that he was helping his mom due to an electrical fire that happened and he's trying to help her get the store back together. Robert doesn't buy it. Later, while they were both sitting, Robert and Ralphie both discussed their suspicion about the fire. Later that evening, two crooked cops, Walmart and Peterson, were eating at Ralphie's mom's restaurant, waiting so that they can help her close early to try and extort money from her. Later that evening, the two cops are confronted by Robert, who says he wants to report a crime and they tell him to dial 911, but when he calls one of their phones, they come back and he tells him that he has video footage of them shaking down convenience store clerks and he's going to report them. When they threaten to kill him, Robert quickly disarms them both, forcing them to return all of their extorted money, or telling them that he has a video that he's going to show to the media and report them if they don't return all of their extorted money, which they did, and Ralphie's mom was extremely happy. Meanwhile, Teddy pays a visit to Mandy, Elena's friend. When questioned about how long she's known Elena, at first she says not long, but eventually she tells him she knows her. He already knows this and continues to get information from her. She states that there was an African-American man who was asking around about Elena's well-being. Teddy thanks her. He continues on and eventually he strangles her before leaving. The next day, Robert is spotted at a baseball game with his co-workers. Ralphie appears sporting his new security uniform in which he passed the test. Both Robert and his other co-workers are proud and he tips his hat. The next day, a criminal attempts to rob the Hallmark store. He demands money from the cashier and Robert steps in, removes the money without incident, and gives it to him. At this point, the robber decides he wants to take the wedding ring off of the cashier. Robert doesn't intervene, he just studies him at this moment. Then he sees someone coming in with children, so he decides not to react, allowing him to take the ring, but also noting his license tag. Later that day, police inform Robert and the other managers that this man has been involved with a string of robberies. Robert decides at this moment that he's going to take care of it. He takes a sledgehammer. The following day at work, the cashier's ring is returned and she's happy, while Robert cleans off the sledgehammer and returns it to its shelf. As night approaches, Teddy visits Robert's home under disguise of being a detective looking for the murderers of the 5 Russians, showing him a picture of a deceased Mandy. The rest of the day, Robert gathers items for travel, even forging a prescription for meclizine, a drug commonly used for motion sickness during air flights. Later, Teddy gets his crew to follow him with the intention of killing him later. However, Robert notices the workers' hands and notices that they were soft compared to a worker's hands who would normally have been working on a construction site. Meanwhile, outside, Teddy's view is obscured by a van that pulls up right in front of the diner. As this is happening, the man inside the diner stands up with an Uzi, demanding that Robert come outside. He studies the man, looks at his stopwatch, and then immediately disarms and kills him on the spot. Then he short-circuits the diner, plunging it into darkness, casually walking out, taking pictures of Teddy and his henchmen. Teddy then orders his men to follow Robert, but not to kill him, to bring him in alive. Robert deliberately leaves a handprint of blood to throw them off. He also manages to isolate one of the dirty cops and gets his phone. Meanwhile, Robert has to tend to a gunshot wound, so he boils honey and is able to escape just before the men arrive, deliberately leaving the sink running where he watched from a vantage point across the street. As the men were rummaging, they found the receipts of a flight to Mexico, assuming that this was part of Robert's escape plan. However, Teddy dismisses it as a trick. He thinks that Robert is watching them, and they continue looking for him. Meanwhile, Robert goes to visit two of his friends that used to work at the agency with him. Both Susan and Brian were very obliging, with Robert asking Susan to look up information concerning Teddy and his henchmen. While Susan goes off to gather documentation from the agency, Brian lets Robert know that he's happy to see him. It turns out that Robert had faked his own death years earlier. However, Susan had always anticipated this. Brian goes on to say that he knew that Robert would not be so simple to fall for such a car bombing trick. Meanwhile, Susan arrives back via helicopter and informs Robert that the man that he killed belonged to a group ran by Nikolai Pushkin, who's a Russian mob boss that Teddy works for. It was also noted that the two dirty cops were most recently found dead. They were also on his payroll at one time. Susan finally issues a stark warning to Robert that these men will stop at nothing to kill him and everyone he cares about. Returning to the city, Robert tracks down Frank, sets off his car alarm to draw him out. Once Frank comes out to investigate and makes his way over to his garage, he's unaware that Robert's there waiting on him. And after rigging up his car to make a makeshift gas chamber, Robert incapacitates him. And after some time, he eventually agrees to cooperate. Robert questions him on information concerning Pushkin. Led by Frank, Robert is led to a warehouse where the Russians store their money. After coercing their men and tricking them, Robert locks them all in the freezer, paying the workers lumps of cash as they leave. As Robert discusses with Frank his oath as an officer, he forces him to call the police and report it. Later, the police arrest him and find the workers and money. Robert then goes to Frank's safety deposit box, looking for a USB that contains information of Pushkin's operation. In another part of the city, a Russian mercenary is discussing the assassination with Teddy of Robert. After the mercenary excuses himself to the restroom, a few minutes later, McCall brings the broken glasses back from the mercenary with blood on them, warning Teddy to tell Pushkin to stop his operation or die. Teddy, in turn, tells McCall that he's a piece of lint, a minor discrepancy in his way. McCall laughs it off, tells him of a story of a Russian teenager who was 12 years old, who was adopted by foster parents and killed them. He's referring to Teddy, who in turn tells him that to show any type of sympathy is weakness. McCall in turn leaves a note for Teddy to call him and let him know about his offer. As the night progresses, McCall puts Frank's USB to work, transferring millions of dollars of Pushkin's money over to the FBI's database. He also finds out where the tankers are located, sets bombs, and blows them up, causing even further damage and more economic loss for Pushkin. At this point, Teddy organizes his mercenaries and takes McCall's co-workers hostage. He sets an ultimatum for McCall to give himself up within 30 minutes or all of his co-workers will die. He also tries to track his cell phone but realizes he left it on the bus as a distraction so that he can get into the store. As Ralphie is singled out and brought over to a different section, it's a trap set by McCall, who then takes out the mercenaries. McCall then instructs Ralphie to get all of the other employees out so that he can take care of the invaders. As Teddy and his men enter the facility, the lights go out. McCall has set a trap for them, and one by one, he begins to exterminate them. One of the mercenaries notices his friend hanging, and McCall exterminates him with a garden tool. As Teddy rounds the corner, he manages to shoot McCall in the shoulder, injuring him. However, he gets away, all while using a blowtorch to cauterize his wound. As the mercenaries come upon Robert's puddle with a blowtorch, they think it's a trap, back off, but he takes one out immediately, while he waits for the other and patiently takes him out as well. Ralphie attempts to help him, but is shot in the leg. He helps Ralphie and takes him to the front, asking him to go to the breaker box and wait 40 seconds before turning it on. As Ralphie continues on his mission, one of the assailants is drawn by drops of blood that McCall left on purpose into a break room that has compressed air inside of a microwave. Once Ralphie turns the lights on, the explosion happens and kills the intruder. As Teddy notices Ralphie has been helping McCall, he comes with murderous intents on trying to exterminate him. However, Robert comes and intervenes by immobilizing Teddy by shooting nails into his pressure points. As he asks Robert who he is, he fires one more shot to end Teddy. Just 3 days later, Robert travels to Moscow, to the estate of Pushkin, where he catches him off guard in the shower. As Robert's flicking the lights on and off, Pushkin exits and attempts to bribe himself. Robert says he's coming for the head of the snake, and as Pushkin exits the bathroom, Robert is gone. However, Pushkin notices electrical outlets and water running. As McCall exits his building, you can hear Pushkin screaming in agony as he's electrocuted to death. Robert walks past his guards. The next day, Elena confronts Robert, telling him that she thanks him and she's changed her life. She also tells him that she knows that he's the reason why she's alive. Robert obliges and tells her to do something with her life. 3 months later, Robert is seen placing an ad offering his services, later answering yes to an ad request, dubbing himself as the Equalizer. We hope you enjoyed the review of the Equalizer. Stay tuned for the second movie. Please like, share, and subscribe.